Welcome everyone to Brainwash Festival. This year our theme revolves around doubt and rationality, reality, imagination, fact, fiction, madness and truth. How do we determine what is reasonable? Who do we trust with the truth? We'll explore the dividing line between the rational and the irrational, investigate the power of algorithms, ideologies and money, and we'll discuss the values that underlie those structures. This is quite a lot. We're not going to do this all in one program. Luckily, today in this program we will talk about how the male body has for far too long been the norm in medicine, neurobiology, palaeoanthropology and evolutionary biology. And it's time for a paradigm shift. My name is Jante Mosselman and I will take you through this program. In the next 50 minutes, I'll go into conversation with academic Cat Bohannon and Professor of Inclusive AI, Payal Arora, about how we can move beyond the norms. There will be room for questions at the end of this program. And just a small note, before you ask a question, to keep in mind that this program is live streamed. So if you ask a question, you might be on the internet for eternity. Just so you know. I'm briefly going to introduce Cat, and then we'll start, and she will give a short opening lecture. Cat Bohannon is a science researcher and received her PhD from Columbia University. She has published in Mind, Scientific American, and Science magazine, amongst others. Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, is her debut novel. And I found this quite funny to say because it's a debut, but it's super big. It's like 2 books in one. So before we go into conversation, please give her a warm applause and she will lead the way.
Hi, everyone. Look, okay, the last third is like notes, and there are so many jokes. All right, so you can definitely do this, whether or not you have a PhD, just to be very clear. Okay, right, so I'm Kat. You already got all that, and I won't waste time telling you more about myself. That would be a waste. So I wrote this book, Eve. I'm not going to tell you all about the book. It covers 200 million years of mammalian evolution all the way up to now with the perspective of the female of the many genus and species along the way. We will also not cover 200 million years in the next 50 minutes. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of some a moral impetus, if you like. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick clip. Nope. I'm going to pause here. There we are. Okay, so what do you need to know? This is from the film Prometheus. It is the prequel to Alien. Okay, so director Ridley Scott making a turn back. Now, what do you need to know about this woman here? Well, she is Dr. Elizabeth Shaw. It's never quite clear what she has a doctorate in. She's sciences, okay? And she has traveled all the way to some far-ass planet, and her spaceship, of course, has crashed. And Mr. Ridley Scott, her director, has decided she should, at this moment in the script, be impregnated with a vicious alien squid. As you do. Now, in such a moment, as anyone would want, she would like this to stop. Yes, and so she is going to go and ask what we all know is the future of medicine, which is a kind of sexy coffin. It's the med pod, and she's just going to ask the med pod for a procedure, which it will then magically do. I want a med pod. Anyway, right, and what she wants, of course, is a C-section, which, again, a very reasonable thing to want. Let's see how it goes for her.
Emergency procedures initiated. Please verbally state the nature of your injury.
I need cesarean.
Error. This med pod is calibrated for male patients only and does not offer the procedure you have requested. Please seek medical assistance elsewhere.
So that's going well. That's going well. What follows this scene is a kind of gruesome thing with a lot of blood, and she basically gives herself a C-section with lasers and some staples, and there's writhing tentacles, and somehow she escapes and then goes on to have more terrible things happen to her because sci-fi. She's our final girl. That's what we seek in sci-fi. We are sadists. Anyway, so there it goes. But the thing that you need to know about this moment is that I was sitting in a darkened theater in New York in 2012. I was a grad student at Columbia, yeah? And I heard a woman in the row behind me say, shit, who does that? Yeah, who does that? Who sends a multi-trillion-dollar expedition into space and forgets to make sure that the medical equipment works on women? Oh, see, the thing is, well, I was at Columbia and I happen to know that's us. That's us. That's actually you and me and everyone in this room right now, not in alien franchises at all. And in fact, if you have ovaries in your body, you are already, in many ways, kind of already Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, because there's such a thing as the male norm. I learned this at Columbia. I'm now letting you know if you don't already. So for a very, very long time in biology and the biomedical sciences, we were effectively only studying males. Okay, whether we were talking about our rodent models, or we were talking up to pigs or our non-human primates, and sometimes even in human beings, we were only studying males. It was dicks all the way down, people. It was just penis town, okay? And in this case, it wasn't because of sexism. Isn't it nice to have something that for once isn't because of sexism? It's kind of like that moment that, oh, this wasn't racism either. God, that's a change, right? But in this case, it was actually good science run amok. Okay? Because basically, if you are a reasonably good researcher, you want to control for your confounds. You want what we call an elegant experiment. Yeah? And so you want to be able to interpret your data. You want to know what's driving these things. And so, well, in mammalian bodies, we have this thing called estrus. You and I might call it the menstrual cycle. And so there is this pattern of hormones, sex hormones, that have a certain rise and fall and certain predictable slope. It's different in every species, but there are models, and we know that this is happening. You may not know, if you're not in the field, that nearly every tissue in mammalian bodies might well have sex hormone receptors. Now, we still barely know how any of that shit works because, again, studying males forever. But it's true that it's there, which means that unless you're specifically studying something about the female body, about ovaries or the uterus or what have you, well, this is a huge confound, especially if you don't have good models for what the hell it's doing. And so the easiest way to control for it is to just not. Just don't study the females. That's how you do it, which is fine if we were, in fact, a Mr. Potato Head. But we are not. We do not have hot swappable genitals, generally speaking. And so, well, yes. So that means that there were consequences. What possible consequences could this have had? Well, you may not also know that for a very long time, we also didn't want to include females of reproductive age in our clinical trials for medicine. From about the 70s forward, which was initially a victory story. This was the thalidomide story, for those of you who are old enough to remember. We kind of maybe, I wasn't alive, so don't blame me, but we kind of maybe screwed up a lot of babies, okay? There were some malformed limbs mostly, and it was because there were women in clinical trials who were using a medication, and we didn't think about whether or not it would screw up the kids in the womb, and so in the US, at the FDA, there was a big victory, and we said, don't include females of reproductive age in your clinical trials unless you have a damn good reason, because we don't want to screw up the babies. Sounds like a good plan, but reproductive age is, well, it's about 11 or so, sliding down these days when you get your first period, but it's, and to about 50. Oh, it's most of our damn lives. Right. Certainly most of our adult lives, most of our lives are spent in reproductive age, which meant that for decades, huge numbers of treatments arrived on the market that may well not have been tested on females at all. Not in the rodents, then in the whole research pipeline, not all the way up until the humans even. Which means that we are just now starting to figure out what the consequences might be through mostly retrospective data. Not a great way to find things out. We've had some wins, okay? We've changed some rules. The NIH has changed its rules. The FDA, these are big governing bodies for the sciences and medicine in the United States. There are parallels here in the Netherlands as well, but let me give you a sense of the consequences. Okay, the first one I usually talk about, but we don't have enough time, but the first one I usually talk about is opioid drugs. Opioid drugs are common prescription pain medications. And we have now retrospectively learned that they work a little bit differently in the average female body. It actually turns out that for many of them, you need a little bit more to achieve the same level of subjective pain relief than in a male patient. And it's also true that the slope at which they leave your body is a little bit different. It's not because of body size, it's not a mass problem, in other words. It turns out that it's metabolized through the liver, and actually there is a liver sex problem. But let's do something a little bit simpler. How many of you have ever had insomnia? Yeah. Some hesitantly like, do I want to admit this in public? Yeah, I know we have problems sleeping, right? What else could keep us up at night? God, because the world's great right now, right? Yeah, no war at all. So, okay, females are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with sleep disorders for a variety of reasons we're still starting to figure out. But one of the most common medications for sleep disorders is Ambien. So it turned out that Ambien works a little bit differently in female patients. It turns out we need about half the dose, actually. So a 5 milligram instead of 10, that's the average. But here's how we learned that out, mostly through car crash data, just coming in through slightly different agencies in the US, right? So it's filtering in from hospitals, it's filtering in weirdly from the National Transportation Board. It's filtering in a number of ways, but it turns out that actually female patients who'd taken the recommended dose, trying to get a damn night's sleep the night before, were more likely to get in car crashes on their way to work in the morning. This is what retrospective analysis can produce. So the FDA was like, oh, sorry guys, half the dose and never mind, moving along, right? But at that point, the drug had been on the market for 21 years. I think we can do better, don't you? Right, things are changing. So the FDA figured out in the 90s, and the NIH too, that, oh shit, maybe we should have women in clinical trials, sorry. They're working on that. Now you have to justify why you don't have female patients in your trials as opposed to justify, right? You know, in other words, not that say why you're doing it, now you have to say why you're not doing it. This is a good shift. Okay, but it's still true that females are radically under-enrolled in clinical trials, particularly in phase 1. Okay, the other thing that changed, the NIH realized a little while back that, oh, actually, yeah, if it's only male rats along the pipeline, then actually our whole research pipeline, really we should have better models. And so now, to have funding from the NIH for a good many things, again, you have to justify why you're not including females or sex as a biological variable in your experiments rather than the other way around. These are awesome changes. My book would not exist if it weren't for the actual thousands of scientists who are finally starting to fill in these gaps and figure out what the hell is going on. What is sex? When does it matter? When does it not matter? Because it doesn't matter all the time, but it seems to matter a lot, and we don't entirely always know why. The thing is, change is hard. Because what we're really talking about is a paradigm shift, right? The shift from a monomodel to a dual model, or perhaps a multivariate, right, is actually a fundamental shift in how you understand what a species might actually be. What does it mean to have a model of gastric cancer if it's only a model of gastric cancer in male typical bodies? Well, females do have stomachs, right? What is it to have a model of cardiovascular health and not know that heart attacks may present differently in female bodies? Oh, well, okay. But then to dig down into the mechanisms of how these things work, right? Things are changing, but change is hard. It's also true that the scientific community is made of people. We're just fucking people, okay? Which means that when you're changing something at a paradigmatic level, you're talking about social change, right? Because that's actually how these ideas change. It's not simply that the data presents and then everyone says, oh, well, the data's different now and everything's awesome. No. There are egos involved. There are intergenerational problems. What is it to be somebody in her 60s who's had great success in one or another segment of biology and then be told, oh, but you maybe were building incorrect models all this time? That's a hard thing to suck in. That's a hard thing to say, oh, okay, maybe I was wrong. Saying I'm wrong is hard, right? So my book exists. It's not going to solve all of these problems, but it is a book. And it's trying to ask that basic question. It's sort of a thought experiment. Like, well, what if being female does matter? What if we put the female back in the frame? How does that change what we're looking at? How does that change the frame of the question? How does that change what we're seeing in front of us, right? So, for example, what are breasts for? I mean, they mostly, for me, are shoving into these large industrial these are D's, people. It's a lot of work, okay? It's just like, every morning I have to put gear on just to be in the world, so that's annoying. But maybe you want to know what are breasts for. Well, so I'll tell you an old idea to give you an example of a paradigm shift. This is an old idea of what breasts are for. Well, this is actually a Da Vinci. This is a sketch from Da Vinci. He was actually a very careful anatomist. He did his own anatomical dissections. But in this case, this was a portrait. The reason there's a black bar is that this is his sketch of coitus. This is Da Vinci's idea of heterosexual sex. And the most beautifully rendered thing in this sketch is actually the thing you can't see, which is this incredibly detailed erect penis. That's what's behind there. And the reason it's probably so detailed is because he was not straight. Okay. Anyway. But the thing you want to know here is the vasa menstrualis. Sorry for my pronunciation of Latin, it's terrible. And this is what we, for a very long time, thought milk was. So you'll kind of see up there, you see that kind of boob with a tube attached to it. Look up from where the penis should be, stop imagining that, and just look up. Just look up and you see, yeah. Okay, so they imagined that there was this vein that transformed hot menstrual blood into cool, pure mother's milk through a holy tube, okay? And it's not because this was evil, but this was good. Evil, good, and with the tube then. And they thought, and the thing is that everyone who drew anatomical models drew this damn thing in. They were convinced it was there. People who were actually doing dissections, and they saw this mess of wet tubing, and they were like, well, one of them has to be the thing, right? Because it would so break their brains to imagine that, well, they didn't even know what glands really were, so that's a thing. They didn't know the boobs could actually make the milk. No, they thought that we were a kind of lumpy bag of fluids with different balances, and it's true, careful observation. People who are lactating, very unlikely to be having their periods. It is an ovulation suppressant. Imperfect, that's why you can still get knocked up if you're lactating, use birth control. But nevertheless, right, this was their understanding. So it's not based on a lack of careful observation, it's that they were still under a certain paradigm. I'm not going to teach you about Galenic models right now, but the basic idea is that it takes a lot to change a fundamental frame of how you think body works. And it was not possible for them to think otherwise. So I'll give you a basic thing, and then we're going to start talking with Payal. Okay, paradigm shifts are hard, okay? They take a really long time, all right? The invention of microscopes did not suddenly give us the germ theory of disease, okay? And even once we had a germ theory of disease, it took a hot minute to understand that plague was not caused by an evil fog drifting in from Asia, right? So it takes a bit for something at the paradigm level. Usually you do need new technology. Did help to know what cells were, did help to know what glands were for the whole boob thing, right? You usually have some key discoveries that are usually enabled by that new tech. You need influential adopters. And I don't just mean on Instagram people. I mean, you need people that people trust to believe you, right? You also need widespread explanatory power, right? It's not enough to say that, glands in the breast make milk. You need to have that then say, actually, there are many things explained by this new model. Many things fit now because of this shift. You also need some measure of God on board. You need a bit of God, which is to say that if your discovery fundamentally challenges some cultural belief within the group, right? That's going to be a lot harder of a sell, which of course never comes up with female bodies. Yeah, the one person laughing got it. Okay. You also need intergenerational buy-in, right? You need to understand, if you look past the plant, you need to understand that you need both young and old people to say, yeah, okay, we're doing this thing, right? So what are breasts really for? Well, I'll just show you. This is not an actual person. This is a diagram. I did not bisect a woman for the sake of this. It is quite alarming to look at, I know. So here you have, this is the side boob, right? Okay, side boob, and we have the adipose tissue, that's our yellow, and we have our glands and little tubes going into the baby's mouth. This is suckling. Nipples are a major evolutionary upgrade because now you get to form a vacuum seal with your lips flanging out and sucking in your cheeks. But the thing about feeding, so here you have, these little white arrows, so the milk is being formed and it's going in and it's going in. But if you know anything about about fluidics or vacuums, well, the kid is rolling his tongue underneath the nipple. I know, invasive, but rolling the tongue out, right? And so that means the focus of the vacuum is moving back and forth. And what that does in that enclosed space is it creates a tide. Not entirely unlike what you'd see at shore. So you have the wave of milk coming in over the top, but then what you have is the baby's spit being sucked back into the mother's boob through the nipple with that undertow, where it then apparently is read by like some kind of ancient code by what we assume is an army of immunoagents and sensors that, we do know this, tailor the milk to suit. If the kid is sick, the milk changes. The hormone profile changes, the immunocontent changes. This is true in rat. It seems to be true as well in human. This is a mammalian trait for us nipple havers, okay? So this is pretty much what boobs are for. Finally, maybe that's not what you want to know. Maybe you want to know why they're this shape. Because other primates, non-human primates, don't have this much. They don't have a bra situation, okay? They have it maybe swells a little bit. Gets a little like pancake flappy on a chimp, but it's not this, right? And the reason, and we don't entirely know it's this. We assumed for a very long time that it was because of this. So this is literally a monkey's ass. So these are the female genital swellings. I believe that is a macaque, I'm not entirely, no, baboon, yeah. Anywho, so when she is fertile, and those are actually her labia. There are these large things of tissue that swell up and become super red and become a very obvious signal. Like that chick is fertile right now, okay? And the idea, and this had a lot of traction as an idea in evolutionary science for some time, in primatology, that, it's an eye level signal, isn't it? For your knuckle walkers anyway. So he can just totally see right there, not subtle, obvious sexual signal, fertility signal. Okay, and so then the problem, this was the idea, that, when we evolved to walk upright, it's just obviously men in any bar can't look down. So the idea was this was the obvious problem to solve. And so the theory essentially went like this. Males sad, how help? All right? And I'm really not joking, this is basically what they figured happened. They figured this shape was the new ass. They figured this shape was the obvious sexual signal that was, if not eye level, more eye level. Which definitely sounds like the idea of somebody who's never had a pair. You see, because the reason is there's such a thing as a period bra. Some of the women in this room know what I mean by that. Our breasts swell and change shape regularly across the menstrual cycle and across our lifespan from puberty forward. The moments at which they are their most swollen are not when they're our most fertile, okay? So in other words, right before our periods, huge, swollen, tender, please don't touch them, right? For many women, not all, but many. And while we're actually pregnant already, it's not gonna help you out, dude, right? Or while we're lactating, which is an ovulation suppressant, which is to say, if the growth of these things was a runaway sexually selective trait, then being a boob man is a long game, right? Because it's gonna be a long time before the swollen things are actually going to give you a reproductive payoff. Except for maybe signaling that we've got some extra estrogen on board, but otherwise, no. So the real reason boobs are probably this shape, I'll say real. The most convincing argument I have heard is that it's nice not to suffocate. So babies' faces, human faces, if you look to the profile, pretty flat. I've got kind of a big nose, but, right? That we characteristically as a species have flatter faces, and when we're born, they're even more flat than your average muzzle produce, yeah? And so if we did not have this pendulous shape with a slightly upturned nipple, the flesh of the breast would, on a flatter chest, a much flatter, I mean non-human in other words, would occlude the nostrils, would block up while they're breastfeeding. Just like this. So they would just have to hold their breath the entire damn time, right? They're just trying to get fed. So if all of this fat is an adaptive trait, it's more than likely going to be first functional and only hot later, right? So that's a basic principle. Functionality before attractiveness. This isn't first for you. It's first for babies, but nice that you like them. Okay, so now we're going to bring up Payal, and we're going to have a conversation about why it's so important to include females in our data sets and why, what the scientific payoffs actually might be. Yeah? Good. Come.
Thank you very much for that. I'm briefly going to introduce Payal, and then we'll get started.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Payal is a professor of inclusive AI cultures at University Utrecht and co-founder of FemLab, a feminist initiative for the future of work and the inclusive AI lab. She's a leading digital anthropologist with 2 decades of user experience in the global south and the author of The Next Billion Users. Her latest book, From Pessimism to Promise, Lessons from the Global South on Designing Inclusive Tech, is out now. Welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you. You know each other, and I was wondering, Kat, because you said this is a great opportunity to bring Payal.
Yes.
What is it, how does your work relate?
Well, correct me at any moment, darling. But as far as I'm concerned, how we tell the story of ourselves matters, yeah? The frames of understanding that we create influence not only the success of our social lives, but it's also true that it then feeds back and loops through our data sets. And so if we have poor priors, we will have poor results. If we have poor data sets that are incorrectly modeled, well, then we all kind of get screwed. And that is, in many ways, the center of something you do.
So how incorrect are our data sets?
Yeah, so frankly, I think, Kat nailed it on its head in the sense that garbage in is garbage out, right? And as she mentioned, that in many ways, like, it's not just a male norm. It's like we need to go beyond that is when you add the level of culture. Mm-hmm. Because I'm a digital anthropologist at the heart of it. So storytelling tends to be, looked upon as almost anecdotal and not something on the side. It's not scientific, right? But that's fundamentally how we shift our mindset, how we change the way we look at the world, and which leads to certain kinds of products, services, institutional structures, because we bring information, we bring all this data, which sounds very cold out there, and make it meaningful to us. And the way we do it is through narrative. Mm. And Kat has given us a really compelling narrative about rethinking the evolution, right, of the body through female terms, putting the woman at the center. And I'm going beyond, I put the global south at the center, which is women in the global south, and not as if it's intrinsic to their character or culture, but culture as context and condition. For example, there are women in East Asia flip their eyelids, right? Now, there are certain kinds of issues that get created when you keep doing that. But that's not something that is medical. It's a cultural pressure women are faced with, which signals we like big eyes. Or in Iran, they do a lot of surgeries for noses because that's what is seen. Or in India, right, where women, many of them, in my work, they would not report that ever having sex before marriage. Mm-hmm. They never smoke, they never drink, they never chew tobacco. While they were chewing tobacco, they would tell me that, right? Yeah. And so the thing is, there's a lot of cultural pressure on how you report data, mm-hmm. how it gets captured, and that data set shapes these particularly in today's AI tools, right? The data sets are training these AI tools that then will tell us what you should do, what you shouldn't. It guides us, it nudges us in a particular direction. And so I think this is what I love, is that we both have been following these sort of parallel trajectories on the normative and rethinking and demanding a paradigm shift. And I'm just adding Global South, which, by the way, is 85% of the world's population. 90% of young people live in this context. Just a minor little, glitch that we can't just apply the male norm, and say, all right, we figured it out, and now we've got the women's perspective, but it's from the global north, which is still a sliver. So we need to get past, and also cross-culturally, because the global south is not one entity either, as I brought up. So, yes.
And how do you deal with that if you want to diversify data, but the people you are interviewing are, while chewing tobacco, say they never do it? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, so, actually we were just talking backstage. I was saying that it's not just who you're, like you can go directly to people and say, hey, give me your data. And that's a very lazy way of going about it. You have to really think out of your box. Because look, majority of women in society, in the world, live in patriarchal societies where it is legally where they're legally treated like, children. So they have the rights of a child, right? Whether it's in a guardianship system they basically enjoy a secondary status. So which means that they don't get to be accessed as easily. They don't have access to digital phones. So the methodology, even with digital scraping, which is a really big thing, we can just data scrape like OpenAI, right? And gather that information and shape our tools, except majority of the ones who are online are angry males from the global south.
And they're so mad.
Yeah, they're very,
they're the
very
maddest
mad.
people that have ever existed. Yes,
So,
I've encountered some.
Exactly.
Mostly online.
So you have to really think out of the box and how you go about it. And this is where anthropology comes in, because people are like, well, but that's such a small context. But you have to go down to why people do what they do. And once you understand that, and what's really exciting right now is you can build a small quality data set. And by doing that, you can amplify those through these, what they call the synthetic data methods. So it's better to have a small quality data set than a lot of trash, right? Which is the lazy way of data scraping. And that way we get out of our thinking. But also which places you go to. Like we were talking about Pornhub. Like all these women, and actually nobody before marriage has sex in like India, but I don't know how the population's like the biggest in the world. A lot of sex after marriage, which I know my husband's here. He's like, I kind of got cheated out on that. What happened? So I promised more sex. So anyway.
He is here. That did just happen.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Anyway.
No one owes anybody anything.
Exactly. No, but Pornhub, that's a really interesting thing. The metadata of Pornhub signals that Indians are the biggest consumers, and they know what they're searching, how long they're going, what are their fetishes. There's this entire world. In fact, they're more accurate about gender data in many ways and sexuality of young people than a lot of researchers. So we need to think creatively, embrace Pornhub. I didn't get paid by Pornhub, but I would
a lot
like
of
to
data
be
people. Kinsey has nothing on these people.
Yeah, they should pay me, right? Like
Pornhub
specifically.
specifically.
Yeah, sponsored by Pornhub.
I'll let you know what I can do. I'll make a call, baby. Not my connection. But no, it is true. It's like where you get your data matters, how you imagine your subject pool matters, what you imagine about them and why you think their answers are what they are. I can tell you in sexuality data, which is fascinating, of all of the people in the world, apparently New Zealand women are having more sex with more men than actually exist on the island. They're the only women in the world who, every person lies in these, by the way, anytime you have a taboo especially, but people lie all the time to researchers, or they lie a little bit, right? So famously, sexuality research, right, has a lot of lying, and almost everybody says they have less sex than they actually do, especially there's a gender skew around that, except in New Zealand. In New Zealand, for some reason, New Zealand women, Kiwi women, want you to know, almost instinctively, that they're having so much heterosexual sex. And they do, famously, have not enough men on the island to actually support those numbers. So I don't know what that is. I don't know if that means I need to move to New Zealand. Someone needs to suss it out. Yeah. So your questions, though.
No, that was that's excellent. But I was wondering, because one of the things that, well, as you ended up at the subject of the patriarchy, and one of the things you said that I find very interesting was that sexism is not the only reason why this research has been done on the male body only.
Yeah.
And recently there was a research that came out that showed the brain scans of a woman after she gave birth.
Yes, yes, yes.
And this was only done recently.
Yes.
And I was surprised by it because that's incredibly late, isn't it? Why is this so late, do you think?
So what she's describing is fMRI studies of postpartum women, women who have given birth, and there are also longitudinal studies where there are scans of brains going through pregnancy and then after birth, so you can see in-subject change, and then you also have multi-subjects doing it. The first reason it took so long is that fMRI is really expensive. They're expensive machines, it's expensive to have time, and science doesn't just happen in our backyards, okay? You have to schedule, you know, and people might need scans of brain tumors, so it's actually, that's, the main reason is money. That's true of all, why almost all fMRI studies actually don't have nearly enough subjects. So that's a central reason. The other reason, of course, is just probably sexism, just the idea that it may or may not be a concern, right? And what would one learn? And then the third problem would be how do we even interpret what we're seeing, given that we have a lack of baseline data of female subjects in general, you know, that we have had more males scanned generally, so do we know that we're interpreting in this? Right, anyway, those are all of the reasons. Yeah, those are the reasons. What I found, of course, fascinating by it, and probably if you guys have read about it in the popular press, is that we have seen remarkable restructuring in the brain of a pregnant person, and some of those changes are both predictable, as in you could take a random scan and with the right program you could predict that this is a pregnant or a postpartum person, but also that many of those changes persist over time. I think that we don't entirely know how to interpret that, but it would be great to know if that's a factor for postpartum depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
There are many ways in which we could reduce suffering by knowing more, so that's always worthwhile. Yeah.
I thought of, so this example for me, I think, if you talk about a paradigm shift, could be a sign that it is changing. But I was wondering to you both, is it really changing?
Payal, you go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just to connect also with Cat on the idea that it's not it's not sexism, and what I mean, not only sexism, not the dominant aspect, right? Is that you know, I've been working with a number of tech companies over the last years, and these are really smart, thoughtful, oftentimes women who are like, I really, my heart, I really care about gender data. I mean, that's half the world, right? But they always tell me, can you just get rid of it from our project proposal so we can do Gen Z, because we really want to be objective, because it's all about control. And I find it really fascinating because I'm in the pursuit of building data sets. She's, you know, speaking in also in a similar parallel line, and we both are engaged with people who are trying to be efficient and effective by saying, let's control the situation. And that way, if we build a universal standard product, it'll work for everybody, right? And actually, it doesn't, because you have to be equitable, and it's the reverse. So for example, if you put them at the center because they're chronically under-examined, underrepresented, and you recognize they disproportionately face significant challenges and in different contexts. So when you're designing a mobile phone, or when you're designing, the way in which you have to ask questions of like the way in which you move, the way in which you have access, why do you need to hide? Because there's a strong correlation between hate speech and misogynistic speech. So if you figure out, how women can stay safe online, how they can be pluralistically represented, you're actually going to speak to many different kinds of communities, like migrant communities, religiously persecuted communities, and many others, which actually make the majority world. Actually, that is the normative. And so I think it's people don't quite get it. So, and yet we play that game of erasing the gender, thinking that we will finally fit them in somehow. As Cat brings up, like as if they're added to it, or they're tweaks of the male norm. So the global South is the tweaks of the Western model.
Instead of the majority of all humans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this notion that it has to be versatile. But yes, your question is like, so what's next? Like, is there a paradigm shift? And there is, because there's a lot of, this is why I wrote this book, is that there's this huge pessimism-optimism divide, with the West becoming increasingly pessimistic about, all things tech, the future, climate crisis. And, interestingly, there are polls conducted where it's the reverse with the global South. They are in contrast, highly optimistic. And you would say, are they naive? Do they not see that they're disproportionately impacted? They're the most underrepresented? Actually, it's because these tools allow them to, it's a low barrier of entry, and finally they're able to represent themselves and take ownership because they've got access to digital media. They're building small language models, which are quality data sets, which are far easier and cheaper in their own social linguistic dialects also, not just languages, which allows them to prompt, to curate, to generate the way in which they want to be seen. So, I think this is why they're so enthusiastic, and this is actually going to shape the way in which data sets can be built if we co-design with these populations, right? So that's why I've written this, because there's a lot of gloom and doom, as you probably heard in many earlier talks too, is like usually you stop short of, hey, let's slash our wrists, because what's the point, We have the tech oligarchs is just totally controlling the way in which we live, all our data, ourselves. We've lost control of our bodies. And I think going to one of the fundamental points that Kat has brought up in her book is evolution doesn't mean it's stopped. In fact, the very fact is that evolution means it's in process. That means as long as it's in process, it can change. So it's much like technology. There's no such thing as, we've got the mobile phone. No, every data sets, they're all in motion. That means it is changeable, and we can change it, right? So
agency matters. How you make the argument matters. I think a lot of things are changing for the better. I think there are always, but like I say, paradigm shifts take a long time and change is hard. But I'll also say this. A question I get a lot about my work is like, oh, that's great. That's cool. Cool. Nice. I like the medical stuff in there. But why should men care? Why should male-bodied people care? If the male body is so well studied, if it's so well studied, then why should they care that the female is not? Pity? Should they pity us? Oh, well, pity works for a little while as a rhetorical strategy, but I regret to inform you that pity is brittle and it's time-bound. It breaks fast. What you need is global buy-in. What you need is to talk about payoffs. What do you get by better studying females? How do we all win besides just not being sad about someone else's suffering, right? So there are a number of ways I make that argument, but one of the basic ways is by saying, well, actually we don't have good models for how the average male body works precisely because we have not adequately studied sex differences. We do know that females live longer in many mammalian species. That's not always universally true, but many species, that is true. There is a longevity boost. However, in human beings, there is also a paradox. This is called the morbidity-mortality paradox. In other words, we live longer, but it sucks more. We live longer, but we spend more time sick. We live longer, but why, though, right? So, well, why? Because we're valuable members of society, thank you very much. But Yeah, we'll just leave that right there on the table and just say that, though. We'll tap the sign, right? Women matter. Anyway, so if we don't really understand the mechanisms that are driving that gap, because it doesn't seem to be simply about behavior. Some of it's behavior, aggressive behavior in the wild in many species, but not only. This is true in certain lab rats. Then we're not really understanding what's driving that weird senescence difference. We're not really understanding why being male for many mammals is weirdly dangerous and expensive, biologically expensive, right? So, which is to say, if we're going to improve medicine for male old age, we actually have to study the chicks. Do you see? That's why. And there are many arguments like that to make, basic science arguments about models, but also we will improve their medicine if we better understand these mechanisms.
Thank you both. I'm looking at the time and I'm going to see if there's any questions in the audience. I think we have room for 1, 2, 3 maybe, if you keep them really short.
Please, we're obviously not shy.
Can we have some lights? Yes.
Huh?
Well, it's interesting to know that my brother married a New Zealand woman. I now know why. So thank you for that. But thank you also for these nice books, and also read part of Bitch, Lucy Cook, and I like this more books like this coming. But talking about data, how can we contribute to more data that we can move further on?
Thank you.
Be a subject. Women are radically under-enrolled in so many clinical trials and so many studies, in fact. So not only demand more studies, but sign up, even as a control. Healthy controls are even weirdly hard to come by, even for the best actors who are doing medical research. Famously in phase 1 clinical trials, it is hard to get as many women as one would want. There's probably a lot of drivers for that, but it's true, so that's a thing. That's a thing you can totally do.
Well, right now I have this inclusive AI lab where we have this model where we are working with women creatives in many parts of the global south, Brazil, Ecuador, Kenya, and India, where we're trying to change the way we can see the world. So we are building images, just images. So when you do, women in India or Kenya, whatnot, and women at work in, and also at the intersectional level. So if you're disabled, you're in a wheelchair and you're a woman, or you're a person of color, or etc., what clothes you wear. Because we have a chronic lack of data, and we're doing this across board and populating the Creative Commons. Because we know OpenAI is scraping that. And so we are influencing the data sets and these big tech through that. And we're doing a replication studies, which has lost favor, if you follow the sciences, right? Like, it's not considered novel enough. And so this is a great way, because this is sort of a feminist solidarity where people are like, yes, we want to, take control on how we would like to be represented or not, right? And so that's happening, and I hope people who are interested can, please reach out, and we can share more on how to go about it, because there's so many themes. It's not just women at work, it could be multiple ways in which we can literally take control visually, audiovisually, by populating the Creative Commons, which seems to, it's funny because my students don't even know sometimes what that is.
Actually, can you quickly say that, given I'm looking out at the audience?
Yeah.
I see some blank eyes. Tell them what Creative Commons is.
Basically, where there was this notion that the internet would be free for all, and it would be this kumbaya, and then it went behind proprietary walls. And this is basically one of the few spaces, like a Wikipedia, right? But of audiovisual content where anyone is free to use it without commercial licensing. And that matters. And we've sort of very few spaces besides Wikipedia exists that allows us that. And that's really important, because that feeds into how we engage with people through tools, devices, platforms. So we need to revive that.
Thank you. Maybe one more question? Yeah? Please, to the man in front here.
Thank you for your book, Cat, because it's very nice to read it. Can you reflect also on data in anthropology and history and archaeology, for instance, for the paradigm which should also be with historians and other social sciences?
Yes? Sorry, help me understand the question. I hear that you're saying I did analysis of many different fields. That is true.
Yeah,
but the question is?
Yeah, you told a lot about medical data and
yes.
data, for instance, for today, for science today.
Yes.
But what about historians and anthropologists and history like 3,000 years ago?
Well, so I do. So the book covers about 205 roughly million years of mammalian evolution. It's only called human because the Smithsonian gave me permission to do that with their human evolution thing, which had to do with a lot of early mammals, and I felt free to do that. So that's humans are only about 300,000 years old, roughly. We used to think 2, now we think 3. So the portion of that, which is what we usually think of as history, is a drop. It's a drop, right? It's almost nothing compared to the entire history of our species. That's not to say it doesn't matter. It just, well, representative data, right? Which is to say the majority of history that we talk about we shouldn't assume it represents the best sample of human behavioral patterns over the course, because it's such a small fraction, 3,000 years, as you say, versus 300,000. Paleoanthropologists do good work, but yes, we can't learn everything about what humans are like just by, well, certainly not by just studying the Greeks. There weren't that many of them. But still even, Greece is nice, but come on. Yeah, but I think also, if you do read the book, you'll see that when it does come time for agriculture, quite late in the book, that I do address it. Yeah, it's just that for a very long time, a lot of what we would talk about in archaeology is a non-factor because we were squirrely little weasel bitches for a very long time, okay? Like it took a while to not be arboreal. It took a while before we were up in the trees. It's a bigger story. So that.
I'm sorry, I have to go to otherwise you won't be able to make the final program. So Cat and Payal, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. I'm just going to say that you will both sign your books, sure. I heard, and they are for sale at the book market, and it's in the Melkweg Expo. The final program will take place in the big hall of Bellevue, and it's a performance by Laura van Doren. And everyone is invited to end this day with a drink at the Kring. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you.